January 330 BC. Alexander the Great's army marched into a narrow canyon in the Zagros Mountains. The Macedonian king had conquered everything from Greece to Babylon. He had never lost. The gorge narrowed. Snow covered the rocks. Then the trap sprung. Boulders crashed down from the cliffs. Stones crushed men and horses instantly. Thousands of arrows followed, raining from heights the Macedonians could not reach. Blood stained the snow red. Persian Commander Ariobarzanes had fortified the pass with walls and positioned 25,000 troops on the cliffs above. This was his Thermopylae. The Macedonians were trapped in a killing corridor. Alexander ordered attacks. Every assault failed. Elite units charged and died. The companion cavalry broke against the defenses. More stones fell. More arrows struck. Bodies piled in the narrow pass. For the first time in his career, Alexander retreated. The invincible army withdrew in shock. Hundreds lay dead behind them. Officers stared in disbelief. Ariobarzanes had done the impossible. He had stopped Alexander the Great. That night, Alexander's generals argued strategy. Ptolemy wanted a siege. Craterus suggested finding another route. Perdiccas proposed negotiation. Alexander refused all options. The pass had to be taken. Persepolis waited beyond. Winter was worsening. Time was running out. Then captured shepherds revealed a secret, a mountain trail that circled behind the Persian position. His generals called it suicide. The path would kill men before they reached the enemy. Alexander split his army anyway. One force would stay at the pass entrance, keeping Ariobarzanes distracted. The other would march through freezing darkness over a trail no army had crossed in winter. Hit the like button and subscribe, because what happened next transformed catastrophic defeat into brutal victory. The night march killed men through cold and falls. The survivors reached the Persian rear at dawn. Ariobarzanes found himself trapped between two Macedonian forces in the same gorge he had used as a weapon. The Persian Gates became a slaughterhouse, but this time, Persian blood soaked the snow. The Persian Empire that Ariobarzanes defended in 330 BC was dying. For over 2 centuries, the Achaemenid dynasty had ruled from India to Egypt, commanding the largest empire the world had ever seen. Millions of subjects, dozens of conquered peoples, wealth beyond imagination. That empire was collapsing. 3 years earlier, in 334 BC, Alexander had crossed the Hellespont with 35,000 men. The Persian response had been arrogant and slow. King Darius III believed Greek mercenaries and superior numbers would crush this Macedonian upstart. He was wrong. At the Granicus River, Alexander shattered a Persian army. At Issus, he defeated Darius himself in direct combat, forcing the Persian king to abandon his family and flee. At Gaugamela, Alexander destroyed the largest army Persia could assemble, over 100,000 men reduced to a routed mob. Darius ran east, abandoning his capitals. Babylon surrendered without fight. Susa opened its gates. The western satrapies collapsed one after another. Provincial governors either submitted or died, but the eastern territories remained loyal. Persia proper, the heartland of the empire, had not bent the knee. Satraps like Ariobarzanes refused to accept that 2,000 years of Near Eastern dominance over the Greeks had ended. The Persian Gates stood as the last barrier between Alexander and Persepolis, the ceremonial capital where Achaemenid kings were crowned. Beyond those walls lay the imperial treasury, gold and silver accumulated over generations of conquest. Enough wealth to fund Alexander's campaigns for decades. Ariobarzanes knew if Persepolis fell, the empire died, not just politically, but symbolically. The sacred city where Cyrus the Great and Darius I had built monuments to Persian glory would burn. The treasury that represented Persian power would be looted. The psychological blow would finish what military defeats had started, so he chose to stand where every rational calculation said he should retreat. Alexander was 26 years old. He had become king of Macedon at 20 after his father Philip's assassination. Within 2 years, he had secured Greece, crushed a Thracian rebellion, and launched the invasion of Persia that Philip had planned but never executed. His army was the finest fighting force in the ancient world. The Macedonian phalanx formed the core, rows of infantry wielding sarissas, pikes 18 feet long that created an impenetrable wall of spear points. The companion cavalry, Alexander's elite mounted force, delivered devastating charges that broke enemy formations. Hypaspists, shield-bearing infantry, provided flexibility. Cretan archers and Thracian skirmishers offered ranged support. This combined arms approach had revolutionized warfare. Where Persian armies relied on mass and shock, Alexander used coordination and tactics. His forces could shift from defensive phalanx to offensive cavalry charge in moments. They adapted to terrain, exploited weaknesses, and executed complex maneuvers under pressure. More importantly, they believed they were invincible. Victory after victory had created an aura around Alexander. His men had seen him charge into enemy lines personally, risking death alongside common soldiers. They had watched him take wounds and continue fighting. They had witnessed his tactical genius turn certain defeats into crushing victories. At Issus, trapped against the sea with a numerically superior Persian force surrounding him, Alexander had charged directly at Darius, breaking the Persian center through pure audacity. At Gaugamela, facing odds of 3-1, he had feinted left, then struck right, punching through to Darius again and forcing another royal retreat. The Macedonian army, marching toward the Persian Gates in winter 330 BC, had every reason for confidence. They had crossed from Europe to Asia. They had conquered the richest cities of the ancient world. They had destroyed armies that outnumbered them 5-1. The narrow mountain pass ahead seemed like a minor obstacle. Alpine terrain held no terror for men from mountainous Macedon. Cold weather was familiar. Defensive positions could be flanked or besieged. They expected resistance. They anticipated casualties. But they never imagined what Ariobarzanes had prepared. The Macedonian army walked into the Zagros Mountains expecting another victory to add to their unbroken record. History barely remembers Ariobarzanes. No statues honor him. No cities bear his name. Most ancient sources mention him only in passing, if at all. Yet this Persian satrap made a decision that almost changed the course of world history. Ariobarzanes governed Persis, the heartland province that gave the empire its name. He commanded the military forces responsible for defending the approaches to Persepolis. When news arrived that Alexander had crushed Darius at Gaugamela and was marching south, Ariobarzanes faced a choice. He could retreat, load the Persepolis treasury onto wagons, evacuate the population, and fall back deeper into the eastern provinces. Many satraps had done exactly this. Self-preservation was rational. Alexander had proven unstoppable in open battle. Why die defending a doomed capital? He could negotiate, offer submission in exchange for keeping his position under Macedonian rule. Alexander often allowed cooperative governors to retain power. Surrender meant survival, and possibly prosperity. Or he could fight. Ariobarzanes chose combat. Not because he was foolish or suicidal, but because he understood terrain could neutralize Alexander's advantages. The Macedonian phalanx dominated flat battlefields. The companion cavalry needed space to charge. Alexander's tactical genius required room to maneuver. The Persian Gates offered none of these. The Zagros Mountains formed a natural barrier between Mesopotamia and the Persian plateau. Only a few passes allowed large forces through, and the best route to Persepolis ran through a gorge so narrow that wagons could barely pass. Cliffs rose hundreds of feet on both sides. The trail wound through switchbacks and choke points. Winter snow made footing treacherous. Ariobarzanes saw opportunity. If he could block this pass, Alexander would face months of delay finding alternate routes. Winter would intensify. Supply lines would strain. The Macedonian army might starve or freeze before reaching Persepolis. At minimum, the delay would allow Darius to reorganize resistance further east. He spent weeks preparing. His engineers built stone walls across the narrowest points. Work crews hauled boulders to cliff edges and positioned them for maximum impact. Troops practiced shooting arrows at steep downward angles. Cavalry units drilled rapid response to any breakthrough attempts. Ariobarzanes stationed 25,000 infantry on the heights and kept 700 cavalry mobile to plug any gaps. He personally inspected every defensive position. He knew this battle would define his legacy and possibly save the empire. The ancient sources disagree on Ariobarzanes' fate. Some say he died fighting in the final assault. Others claim he escaped and continued resistance elsewhere. What is certain is that he fought with absolute commitment against impossible odds. When the Macedonians entered his trap, Ariobarzanes achieved what no Persian commander had done. He defeated Alexander the Great in battle. The Zagros Mountains stretch over 900 miles from eastern Turkey through Iraq and into southern Iran. These peaks form one of the most formidable natural barriers in the ancient world, a wall of stone separating the Mesopotamian plains from the Persian plateau. The range rises abruptly from lowlands, climbing to heights exceeding 14,000 feet. Parallel ridges run northwest to southeast, creating a series of barriers that any invading army must cross sequentially. Between these ridges lie deep valleys, where winter temperatures plunge below freezing, and summer heat becomes unbearable. The Persian Gates occupied a strategic position in the southwestern section of the range. Ancient geographers identified it as the primary route connecting Babylon to Persepolis. Armies, trade caravans, and royal messengers had used this pass for centuries. No practical alternative existed for moving large forces quickly between Mesopotamia and the Persian heartland. The pass itself was a geological trap. The trail entered a canyon where vertical cliffs rose 300 feet on both sides. The gorge bottom measured barely 50 feet wide at its broadest point. In several locations, the passage narrowed to 20 feet, wide enough for a single wagon or a few horses riding abreast. The trail climbed steadily through switchbacks. Sharp turns forced travelers to slow their pace. Loose rocks covered sections of the path, making footing uncertain even in good weather. Numerous spots offered no room to turn around. Once committed to entering, an army had to push forward or retreat backward through the same choke point. In January 330 BC, winter conditions made everything worse. Snow accumulated in drifts that obscured the trail. Ice formed on rock faces, turning climbs into deadly ascents where one slip meant falling hundreds of feet. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night and barely rose above freezing during the day. Wind funneled through the canyon with brutal force. The confined space created a wind tunnel effect that amplified every gust. Soldiers had to lean forward just to maintain balance. Horses struggled against the constant buffeting. Any equipment not secured properly would be torn away and lost. Visibility varied dramatically. When snow fell, it created near whiteout conditions where men could barely see 10 feet ahead. Even in clear weather, shadows from the high cliffs plunged sections of the trail into perpetual twilight. Sunlight reached the canyon floor for only a few hours each day. Water sources were scarce. Most streams had frozen solid. Troops had to melt snow for drinking water, a process that consumed time and fuel. Dehydration became a constant risk despite the cold temperatures. The altitude affected breathing. While not extreme by mountain standards, the Persian Gates sat high enough that men accustomed to sea-level campaigning in coastal regions felt the thinner air. Exertion became more difficult. Stamina decreased. Recovery from wounds or illness slowed. For a defending force, these conditions created perfect opportunities. Attackers had to advance in column formation, unable to deploy into battle lines. They could not see threats until directly upon them. Retreat under fire would create chaos in the confined space. Every natural feature favored defense. Ariobarzanes transformed natural advantages into a killing system. His engineers studied the canyon for weeks, identifying every defensive position and potential weakness. What emerged was a layered defense that turned the Persian Gates into an execution chamber. The first barrier was a stone wall built across the narrowest section of the pass. The wall stood 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, constructed from local rock fitted tightly without mortar. Battlements along the top provided cover for defenders. The wall had no gate. Anyone wanting through had to demolish it or climb over it under fire. Behind the main wall, engineers built 2 additional walls at intervals of 50 yards. If attackers somehow breached the first barrier, they would face immediate fire from the second while trapped in the confined space between fortifications. The third wall served as final fallback position and supply depot. The real innovation was vertical defense. Ariobarzanes positioned his 25,000 infantry along both sides of the canyon at multiple elevations. The lowest troop stood just above the trail, close enough to throw rocks by hand. Mid-level positions housed the bulk of archers and slingers. The highest positions held boulder crews and observers who could see the entire length of the pass. Each position connected to others through narrow trails carved into the cliff face. Defenders could shift reinforcements to threatened sections quickly, while remaining invisible to attackers below. Supply caches distributed along these trails ensured troops would not run out of ammunition, even during extended combat. The boulder positions deserved particular attention. Work crews had spent weeks identifying loose rocks and large stones, then positioning them at cliff edges directly above the trail. Wooden levers and fulcrums allowed small teams to tip massive rocks over the edge. Gravity did the rest. A boulder weighing several hundred pounds, falling 300 feet, hit with enough force to smash through anything in its path. Ariobarzanes had calculated exact drop zones. His crews marked the trail below with painted rocks indicating where boulders would impact. Observers watched for enemy forces entering kill zones, then signaled boulder teams to push. The system allowed precision targeting despite the height differential. Arrow positions covered every angle. Archers trained to shoot at steep downward angles, compensating for the trajectory changes this created. They practiced estimating range against targets hundreds of feet below. By the time Alexander's army arrived, Persian bowmen could hit man-sized targets consistently from positions the Macedonians could not even reach with return fire. The 700 cavalry remained mobile on the plateau above the canyon. If any attackers somehow climbed the cliffs or found alternate routes to the heights, cavalry would intercept them. These mounted troops also served as rapid reserve, able to reinforce any threatened section within minutes. Supply logistics supported extended defense. Warehouses carved into cliff faces held arrows, javelins, food, and water. Ariobarzanes had stockpiled enough ammunition for weeks of continuous combat. His troops could rotate shifts, keeping fresh defenders always on position while others rested in sheltered areas out of the wind. Communication systems linked all positions. Signal flags during daylight and torches at night allowed commanders to coordinate responses. Horns and drums relayed specific orders. The entire defensive network functioned as a single coordinated weapon. Medical stations treated wounded defenders without requiring evacuation through the killing zone. Cooks prepared hot meals that sustained troops in freezing conditions. Even latrines were positioned to avoid contaminating water sources. Ariobarzanes had considered everything. He knew Alexander's army would be larger, better trained, and more experienced. But in this terrain, with these fortifications, numbers meant nothing. The Macedonian phalanx could not form. The companion cavalry could not charge. Alexander's tactical genius had no room to operate. The Persian Gates were ready. All that remained was for the invincible army to walk into the trap. Alexander's army approached the Persian Gates in standard march formation. Scouts had reported a defended pass ahead, but this intelligence generated little concern among Macedonian commanders. They had encountered defensive positions before at river crossings, city walls, and mountain trails. Each time, Macedonian ingenuity and force had prevailed. The vanguard consisted of light infantry, Agrianians and Thracian peltasts trained for rough terrain. These troops moved ahead of the main column, checking for obvious threats. Behind them came units of hypaspists, elite shield-bearing infantry who could transition quickly from march to combat formation. The main phalanx followed in column. 16,000 heavy infantry carrying sarissas advanced in ordered files. The confined trail forced them to march in narrow columns rather than their preferred wide formations. Officers maintained discipline, ensuring proper spacing between units. Companion cavalry rode near the center of the column, where Alexander typically positioned himself. The narrow trail limited their effectiveness, but their presence provided psychological reassurance. These elite horsemen had broken enemy lines at every major battle. Their armor gleamed despite the gray winter sky. Supply wagons and pack animals stretched the column even longer. Food, ammunition, siege equipment, and personal baggage required hundreds of carts and thousands of animals. The logistics train moved slowly, creating gaps in the formation. As the army penetrated deeper into the gorge, the canyon walls rose higher. Soldiers glanced up at the cliffs towering above them. A few veterans noted the excellent defensive position such terrain offered, but no one expected the Persians to have occupied every viable spot. The trail narrowed further. What had been a path 50 feet wide compressed to 30, then 20 feet. The phalanx could no longer maintain proper file spacing. Men bunched closer together, shoulders nearly touching. The sarissas, 18 feet long, had to be carried vertically to avoid tangling. Officers shouted orders to maintain formation discipline. The troops complied, but the physical constraints of the terrain made proper military formation impossible. The Macedonian army, designed for open battlefield combat, compressed into a dense mass of men and equipment squeezed between stone walls. Still, they advanced. Persepolis lay ahead. Glory and gold awaited. The cold was miserable and the terrain challenging, but nothing suggested mortal danger. These were professional soldiers who had marched through worse conditions in campaigns across Asia Minor. Then, the vanguard reached the first wall. The stone barrier appeared suddenly around a sharp bend in the trail. 12 feet of fitted rock blocked the entire width of the pass. Macedonian officers halted the column and sent runners back to Alexander. A defensive wall was expected. The question was whether defenders manned it, or if the Persians had abandoned the position. The answer came immediately. Horns blasted from the cliffs above. The sound echoed off canyon walls, amplified and distorted into a terrifying cacophony. Persian war cries followed, thousands of voices screaming challenges and insults. The first boulder fell. A rock the size of a wine barrel dropped from 300 feet above. It struck the trail 20 feet ahead of the Macedonian vanguard with an impact that shook the ground. Stone fragments exploded outward. 2 soldiers caught by flying debris went down screaming. Then dozens more boulders followed. Rocks fell like rain from multiple positions along both cliff faces. The Persians had positioned their ammunition precisely. Boulders crashed into the compressed Macedonian column with devastating effect. A stone weighing 400 pounds struck a group of hypaspists directly. 3 men died instantly, crushed to pulp inside their armor. The boulder continued rolling, smashing into soldiers behind them. Men screamed warnings. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The tight formation that had seemed merely uncomfortable seconds ago became a death trap. Soldiers could not dodge. The canyon width provided no room for evasive movement. They could only watch boulders falling toward them and hope the impact landed elsewhere. A massive rock hit a supply wagon, reducing it to kindling and killing the oxen pulling it. The wreckage blocked the trail. Troops behind the obstruction pushed forward while those ahead tried to retreat, creating a crush of bodies. Arrows followed the boulders. Thousands of shafts descended from positions on both sides of the gorge. Persian archers shot at steep downward angles, their arrows arcing up before plunging down. The trajectory made shields nearly useless. Macedonians raised their shields overhead, but arrows came from multiple angles. Shafts found gaps in armor, struck exposed legs and feet, punched through leather and into flesh. An arrow hit a companion cavalryman in the throat. He toppled from his horse, blood fountaining. The horse bolted, crashing into infantry and creating more chaos. Other wounded horses screamed and thrashed, their panic spreading through the confined space. The vanguard attempted to advance against the wall. Hypaspists rushed forward with scaling ladders and climbing ropes. Boulders crushed them before they covered half the distance. Archers on the wall shot down at point-blank range. Bodies piled at the wall's base. A second assault wave charged. More men died. The survivors retreated, trampling wounded comrades in their desperation to escape the kill zone directly beneath the wall. Alexander received reports of the disaster and pushed forward through the column to assess the situation personally. What he saw horrified him. His invincible army was being slaughtered without inflicting a single casualty on the enemy. The Macedonians could not reach their attackers. Archers tried return fire, shooting upward at cliff positions, but the extreme angle and distance made accuracy impossible. Most arrows clattered harmlessly against rock faces. Persian defenders stood safely behind stone parapets, immune to counterattack. Boulders continued falling. Each impact killed or maimed multiple soldiers. The trail became slick with blood. Wounded men slipped on gore and fell, only to be trampled by panicking troops trying to escape falling rocks. The noise was overwhelming. Screams of dying men mixed with war cries from above, the crash of boulders striking stone, the whistle of arrows, the frantic shouting of officers attempting to restore order. The canyon walls reflected and amplified every sound into a hellish din that destroyed morale as effectively as the physical weapons. Macedonian officers tried organizing shield walls for overhead protection. Troops locked shields together and huddled beneath them. This provided some defense against arrows, but made them stationary targets. Boulders smashed through shield formations, breaking the protective coverage and killing everyone beneath. Alexander ordered the companion cavalry to charge the wall. It was a desperate move born of desperation. The cavalry advanced at a trot. They could not gallop in the confined space. Persian archers concentrated fire on the mounted troops. Horses fell, throwing riders. Wounded animals blocked the trail. The charge dissolved before reaching the wall. More boulders fell. More arrows descended. The Macedonian column compressed further as rear units pushed forward, unaware of the carnage ahead. The crush of bodies became so tight that men could barely move their arms. Those who fell were trampled to death by their own comrades. A boulder struck the canyon wall and shattered, sending razor-sharp stone fragments spraying across the trail like shrapnel. Dozens of soldiers suffered cuts in embedded rock shards. Some lost eyes to flying debris. The wounded added their screams to the chaos. Alexander realized the position was untenable. Every minute of remaining in the killing zone cost lives with zero progress. His tactical genius, which had won every previous battle, offered no solution here. The terrain negated every advantage the Macedonian army possessed. The order to withdraw came in the afternoon. Alexander personally gave the command, his face a mask of controlled fury. Officers repeated the order down the compressed column. The Macedonian army would retreat. Executing withdrawal under fire proved nearly as deadly as the initial assault. The column had to reverse direction in a space barely wide enough for forward movement. Rear units needed to become the vanguard. Supply wagons had to turn around on a trail that offered no turning space. Wounded men had to be carried backward through the formation. Persian defenders increased their fire intensity. They recognized the withdrawal and exploited Macedonian vulnerability. More boulders fell on troops trying to organize the retreat. Arrows targeted officers whose distinctive armor and crested helmets marked them as commanders. A boulder crushed a phalanx commander. His death created confusion in his unit. Men broke ranks and ran, colliding with soldiers from other units attempting orderly withdrawal. The formation discipline that defined Macedonian military effectiveness collapsed into individual survival instinct. The withdrawal took hours. Troops near the rear of the original column exited the canyon quickly. Those caught deeper in the gorge had to fight their way backward while under continuous bombardment. Some units maintained cohesion. Others disintegrated into mobs of terrified men fleeing for their lives. Wounded soldiers who could not keep pace were abandoned. The Macedonians had no choice. Stopping to help the injured meant exposing more men to fire. Officers made brutal calculations, sacrificed the wounded to save the mobile troops. Men with broken legs or severe wounds begged comrades not to leave them. Most were left behind anyway. As the army cleared the kill zone, Persian fire slackened and then stopped. Ariobarzanes saw no point wasting ammunition on retreating enemies. His troops cheered their victory while Macedonians stumbled out of the canyon in shocked silence. The final casualty count numbered in the hundreds. Exact figures vary in ancient sources, but Alexander lost between 300 and 700 men, killed, wounded, or captured. For an army that had conquered empires while suffering minimal losses, these numbers represented catastrophic failure. More damaging than the casualties was the psychological impact. The Macedonian army had retreated from battle for the first time in Alexander's reign. The myth of invincibility had shattered. Soldiers who had marched with absolute confidence now questioned whether their king could overcome this obstacle. Officers gathered around Alexander as the army established camp outside the canyon. Ptolemy, Craterus, Perdiccas, and other senior commanders waited for their king to speak. The silence was heavy with unasked questions. What none of them knew was that Ariobarzanes had just made a fatal mistake. He had defeated Alexander in battle, but he had not killed him. And Alexander, humiliated and enraged, would spend that night planning something so audacious that even his own generals would call it madness. The Persian Gates had stopped the Macedonian army, but the battle was far from over. Night fell over the Macedonian camp. Fires burned weakly in the bitter cold. Soldiers huddled in groups, speaking in low voices about the day's disaster. Medical tents overflowed with wounded men. Screams echoed through the darkness as surgeons amputated crushed limbs and extracted arrow shafts. Alexander sat in his command tent, surrounded by maps and senior officers. Ptolemy stood to his left, arms crossed. Craterus paced near the entrance. Perdiccas studied a crude sketch of the canyon defenses. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, sat silently in the corner. The council of war began without ceremony. Craterus spoke first, advocating for a prolonged siege. Starve the Persians out, cut their supply lines, wait for winter to break their will. The strategy was methodical and safe. Alexander rejected it immediately. Time was the enemy. Darius fled further east with each passing day. Winter was intensifying, not weakening. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. A siege could take months. The Macedonian army would starve before the Persians did. Ptolemy suggested finding an alternate route through the mountains. Send scouts to locate another pass to Persepolis. Bypass the Persian Gates entirely. The approach was logical and minimized further casualties. Alexander dismissed this option as well. Every alternate route would add weeks to the march. The delays would allow Darius to escape beyond reach. More importantly, abandoning the gates would concede victory to Ariobarzanes. The psychological damage of retreating without defeating the Persian position would spread throughout the empire. Every remaining Persian garrison would gain courage. Every wavering satrap would choose resistance. Perdiccas proposed negotiation. Offer Ariobarzanes gold, promises of position under Macedonian rule, safe passage for his troops, buy passage through the gates rather than fight for it. Alexander's response was silence. The other officers understood. The king who had conquered half the known world would not purchase what should be taken by force. Negotiation meant weakness. Weakness invited more resistance. The discussion circled without resolution. Each strategy had merit. Each had fatal flaws. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Persian gates were impregnable to frontal assault. Ariobarzanes held every advantage. The terrain negated Macedonian superiority in tactics and training. Alexander studied the maps. His finger traced the canyon's path through the Zagros range. The gorge was one route through the mountains, not the only route. Somewhere in these peaks existed trails, paths, ways through that did not pass under Persian arrows and boulders. But finding such routes with winter storms brewing and time running short seemed impossible. Local guides were scarce. The Macedonians were foreigners in hostile territory. Most shepherds and villagers had fled or hidden. Those captured knew little about military movements through mountain terrain. The officers debated into the night. Arguments grew heated. Voices rose. Craterus insisted siege was the only rational choice. Ptolemy maintained that alternate routes must exist. Perdiccas argued negotiation saved lives. None convinced Alexander. The king sat silent, staring at maps that showed a problem without solution. His army waited outside, their confidence shaken. His enemies grew bolder with each hour of inaction. His strategic position deteriorated while he sat in a tent arguing with subordinates. Then a guard entered with news that would change everything. Macedonian scouts had captured a group of shepherds in the foothills 5 miles from camp. The prisoners were local men who grazed flocks in the Zagros highlands. They knew the mountains intimately. More importantly, they knew trails the Persians did not guard. Alexander ordered the shepherds brought to his tent immediately. 4 men arrived under guard, their hands bound, fear visible in their eyes. They expected execution. Persian commanders routinely killed captured locals to prevent information leaks. Alexander surprised them by offering wine and food. Through interpreters, he questioned them about the mountains. Did trails exist that bypassed the Persian Gates? Could an army move through such routes? How difficult was the terrain? The shepherds hesitated. Providing information to invaders was treason against Persia. But Alexander offered gold, promises of safety, and threats of what would happen if they refused. One shepherd, older than the others, finally spoke. A trail existed, a narrow path used by shepherds moving flocks between summer and winter pastures. The route climbed high into the peaks, circled north around the Persian positions, then descended behind the gates. It emerged on the plateau where Ariobarzanes kept his cavalry reserve. The other officers leaned forward. This was the opportunity they needed. But the shepherd continued with details that dampened enthusiasm. The trail was barely wide enough for men walking single file. Horses could not use most sections. The path crossed sections of sheer cliff, where handholds were scarce. Winter snow would obscure the trail entirely in places. Men would have to wade through drifts waist deep. The altitude caused breathing difficulty. The cold at night would kill men without proper shelter. Even in summer, with experienced guides and light loads, the journey took 2 full days. In winter, with armed men carrying equipment, it might take 3 or 4 days. If storms hit during the crossing, everyone on the trail would die. Craterus immediately declared the route impossible. Sending troops on such a march guaranteed heavy casualties before reaching the enemy. Exhausted men arriving after days of brutal climbing would be useless in combat against fresh Persian defenders. Ptolemy agreed. The risk outweighed potential gain. Better to find a longer, but safer alternate route. Alexander asked the shepherd a direct question. Could the trail be traversed at night? Could guides lead Macedonian troops through darkness to achieve surprise? The shepherd stared at Alexander as if the king had lost his mind. Night made everything worse. Men would fall from cliffs they could not see. They would wander off the trail into crevasses hidden by darkness and snow. Cold intensified after sunset. Without fires for warmth, soldiers would freeze to death. Alexander pressed the question, not whether it was safe or easy, whether it was possible. The shepherd admitted it was possible, barely, with experienced guides and disciplined troops who followed instructions exactly. But the casualties would be severe. Many men would die from falls, cold, and exhaustion before reaching the Persian rear. The tent fell silent. Every officer understood what Alexander was considering. A night march over a mountain trail that shepherds called dangerous in daylight. A flanking movement so risky that even its success would cost hundreds of lives. Hephaestion spoke for the first time. He asked the question everyone was thinking. Even if troops survived the march and reached the Persian rear, they would be exhausted, cold, and reduced in number. Could such a force actually defeat the defenders? Alexander smiled for the first time that night. The force did not need to defeat the Persians. It only needed to attack their rear while the main army assaulted from the front. Ariobarzanes would find himself trapped between 2 forces in the same confined canyon he had used as a weapon. The shepherd would guide them. Alexander would lead the flanking force personally. The march would begin immediately. Alexander selected his troops carefully. The flanking force would number approximately 10,000 men, large enough to be effective, small enough to move quickly. He chose hypaspists and Agrianians, light infantry trained for rough terrain. No cavalry, no heavy phalanx. Speed and stealth mattered more than combat power. Each soldier carried minimal equipment, weapons, a small amount of food, water, 1 blanket. No armor except helmets and light leather protection. Heavy bronze breastplates would exhaust men climbing steep trails. Shields were left behind to free both hands for climbing. The main army under Craterus would remain at the canyon entrance. At dawn, they would assault the gates again, making as much noise as possible. The attack would draw Ariobarzanes' attention forward, while Alexander struck from behind. The flanking force departed camp at midnight. The shepherd led, followed by Alexander and the first rank of hypaspists. 10,000 men stretched in a line behind them, moving single file into darkness. The trail climbed immediately. Within an hour, soldiers were scrambling up slopes using hands and feet. Rocks shifted underfoot. Men slipped on ice and grabbed for handholds. The first casualty occurred 20 minutes into the march when a soldier lost his footing and fell into darkness. His scream cut off abruptly. Officers passed orders in whispers. Absolute silence, no talking, no coughing, no noise that might alert Persian scouts. Every sound echoed in the mountains. Discovery meant death. The cold was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Breath froze in beards. Fingers went numb despite constant movement. Men who stopped moving for more than a few minutes risked frostbite. The single blanket each soldier carried provided inadequate protection. The trail narrowed to a ledge barely 2 feet wide with a cliff face on one side and a drop into blackness on the other. Men pressed against the rock wall, moving sideways, testing each foothold before committing weight. One slip meant falling hundreds of feet. A soldier near the middle of the column panicked on the ledge. He froze, unable to move forward or back. Men behind him piled up. Officers whispered urgent commands. The column could not stop. Finally, comrades physically pushed the terrified soldier forward until he regained movement. Snow began falling. Flakes reduced visibility to almost nothing. The shepherd navigated by memory and feel, recognizing landmarks invisible to the Macedonians. Wrong turns would lead them into dead ends or off cliffs. Trust in the guide was absolute and terrifying. Men fell. A soldier stepped on snow covering empty space and plunged into a crevasse. Another slipped on ice and tumbled down a slope, vanishing into darkness. The column could not stop to help. Officers ordered troops to keep moving. The fallen were lost. Exhaustion set in after 3 hours. Legs cramped from constant climbing. Lungs burned in the thin, cold air. Muscles screamed for rest. Alexander allowed no stops. Rest meant freezing. Rest meant Persian discovery. Rest meant failure. The altitude affected everyone. Breathing became labored. Hearts pounded. Some men vomited from altitude sickness. They vomited and kept climbing because stopping meant death. Dawn approached. The sky lightened from black to gray. Snow-covered peaks became visible around them. The trail descended now, heading toward the plateau behind the Persian Gates. Soldiers could see the gorge below where their comrades prepared to attack. Alexander's force reached the plateau at dawn. 10,000 men had departed. Approximately 8,000 arrived. 2,000 had fallen, frozen, gotten lost, or collapsed from exhaustion. The survivors were beyond exhaustion, cold to their cores, barely capable of holding weapons. But they had achieved complete surprise. Persian cavalry scouts on the plateau saw the Macedonians emerging from a trail they had not known existed. Confusion paralyzed the Persian response for critical minutes. Alexander did not allow his men time to rest. He formed them into attack columns immediately. Speed was everything. Hit the Persians before they recovered from shock. Drive them toward the gates where Craterus waited. In the canyon below, the main Macedonian army launched its assault on schedule. Horns blasted, drums pounded. Craterus threw his entire force at the gates in a frontal attack that mirrored the previous day's disaster. Ariobarzanes responded exactly as Alexander predicted. The Persian commander focused all attention forward. Boulders fell, arrows flew. The Macedonian assault seemed like desperate foolishness, doomed to fail like before. Then Alexander struck from behind. The exhausted, frozen hypaspists charged down from the plateau into the rear of Persian positions. They hit Persian archers stationed on the cliffs from behind. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in positions designed for shooting downward, not defending against attack from above. Persian defenders found themselves fighting in 2 directions simultaneously. Macedonians assaulted from the canyon floor, while Alexander's force attacked from the heights. The coordinated pressure created panic. Ariobarzanes tried to redeploy his forces. He pulled troops from forward positions to counter Alexander's flanking attack. This reduced fire on Craterus's frontal assault. The main Macedonian army surged forward, reaching the first wall. The Persian defensive system, so effective against frontal attack, collapsed when assaulted from multiple directions. Troops abandoned cliff positions and fled toward the plateau. Others retreated deeper into defensive positions that became traps when Macedonians attacked from unexpected angles. Alexander drove his men forward despite their exhaustion. They could rest after victory. Now was the moment of decision. Persian resistance wavered. One more push would break them completely. Craterus's troops breached the first wall using scaling ladders. They poured through gaps in the fortifications. The phalanx, finally able to deploy in proper formation behind the walls, advanced in tight ranks. Sarissas lowered. The killing machine that had crushed armies across Asia engaged. Persian forces trapped between Alexander above and Craterus below faced annihilation. Some units surrendered. Most fought with desperate courage. Officers rallied their men for counterattacks that briefly slowed the Macedonian advance, but could not stop it. The battle raged for hours. Persian defenders sold their lives expensively. But the outcome was inevitable once Alexander achieved his flanking position. The defensive masterpiece Ariobarzanes had constructed became a prison for his own troops. The Persian defensive lines shattered section by section. What had been coordinated resistance devolved into isolated pockets fighting for survival. Macedonian troops methodored through cliff positions, killing defenders who had nowhere to retreat. Persian archers who had rained death on the Macedonians the previous day now found themselves engaged in close combat. Bows were useless weapons against men with swords and spears at arm's length. Archers drew daggers and short swords, inadequate against trained Macedonian infantry with proper melee weapons. The boulder positions became death traps. Persian crews who had pushed rocks onto Macedonians below were now surrounded on narrow ledges with cliffs behind them. High pacifists drove forward with spears extended. Persians had three choices: fight and die, surrender, or jump. Many jumped rather than face Macedonian blades. Bodies fell from the cliffs in a grotesque reversal of the previous day. Where boulders had crashed down onto Macedonians, now Persian corpses tumbled into the canyon. The impact of human bodies hitting rock 300 feet below created sounds that echoed off the canyon walls. Alexander pushed deeper into the Persian positions. His high pacifists moved with brutal efficiency, clearing defensive positions one by one. These were the same troops who had suffered under Persian arrows 24 hours earlier. Their vengeance was methodical and merciless. In the canyon below, Craterus exploited the chaos. His phalanx advanced past the breached walls. Sarissas lowered in attack formation. Persian infantry attempting to hold secondary defensive lines found themselves facing the full might of the Macedonian heavy infantry in terrain that finally allowed proper deployment. The phalanx was unstoppable in this formation. Rows of 18-foot pikes created a wall of spear points that nothing could penetrate. Persian defenders with shorter spears and swords could not reach the Macedonian infantry behind the Sarissa points. They died in rows, impaled on pikes they could not counter. Persian cavalry on the plateau attempted to restore the situation. 700 horsemen charged Alexander's exhausted flanking force. For a moment, the outcome seemed uncertain. Macedonian infantry, drained from the night march, faced fresh cavalry. But Alexander had anticipated this. He positioned his men in defensive formations with overlapping spears. The cavalry charge broke against the infantry lines. Horses reared and refused to advance into the spear points. Riders who pressed the attack were unhorsed and killed. The cavalry commander recognized futility and withdrew. His troops retreated east toward Persepolis, abandoning the infantry in the gates. This withdrawal doomed the remaining defenders. With the cavalry gone, no relief force existed. The Persian infantry was alone, surrounded, and dying. Ariobarzanes watched his perfect defense collapse. The trap that had bloodied the invincible army now became a slaughterhouse for his own men. He had defeated Alexander in open battle. He had forced the great conqueror to retreat. For one glorious day, he had achieved the impossible. But he had not killed Alexander. And that single failure undid everything. The Persian commander gathered his personal guard and remaining officers. They would make a final stand rather than surrender. Persian honor demanded it. These men had chosen to fight when others fled. They would not beg for mercy now. Ariobarzanes formed his last defenders in a tight formation near the third wall. Perhaps 2,000 men remained combat effective from the original 25,000. They locked shields and prepared to sell their lives. Alexander's troops surrounded the position. Macedonian officers called for surrender. They offered honorable terms. The defenders could lay down weapons and depart with their lives. This was standard Macedonian practice: be generous to brave enemies who fought well. Ariobarzanes refused. He would not surrender to the man who had destroyed his empire. He would not live as a defeated commander while Persepolis burned. He drew his sword and pointed it at the advancing Macedonians. The final assault was brief and brutal. Macedonian infantry hit the Persian formation from 3 sides simultaneously. The defenders fought with desperate courage. They killed Macedonians and took wounds and kept fighting. Some fought until literally cut to pieces. Ariobarzanes died in the combat. Ancient sources disagree on the exact circumstances. Some say he fell fighting in the front rank, sword in hand, taking multiple wounds before collapsing. Others claim he was killed by a javelin thrown from distance. All sources agree he died rather than surrender. His death broke the last Persian resistance. Defenders who had been willing to die for their commander now threw down weapons and begged for quarter. Macedonian officers accepted surrenders and pulled their troops back from the slaughter. The Battle of the Persian Gates was over. The body of Ariobarzanes was found among piles of Persian dead. Blood covered his armor. Multiple wounds marked his torso and limbs. His sword remained gripped in his hand even in death. Macedonian soldiers stripped the corpse of armor and valuables. This was standard practice after battle. The dead had no use for gold or weapons. But Alexander, when informed of Ariobarzanes' death, ordered different treatment. The Persian commander had fought with courage and skill. He had achieved what no other Persian general accomplished, defeating Alexander in battle and forcing retreat. That achievement deserved respect even from enemies. Alexander ordered Ariobarzanes buried with military honors. The body was washed and wrapped in clean cloth. Persian prisoners performed the funeral rites according to their customs. Macedonian troops stood at attention while the burial occurred. This gesture was calculated politics as much as genuine respect. Alexander wanted remaining Persian resistance to see him as a legitimate successor to the Achaemenid dynasty, not merely a foreign conqueror. Honoring brave enemies demonstrated that service under Macedonian rule could bring dignity and reward. But the gesture could not change historical reality. Ariobarzanes died defending an empire that was already dead. His courage and tactical skill had delayed Alexander for 2 days. Nothing more. Persepolis would fall. The treasury would be looted. The empire would end. History barely remembers Ariobarzanes. Greek and Roman sources mention him in passing as an obstacle Alexander overcame. Persian records from the period are scarce. No monuments honor him. No cities bear his name. He appears in historical accounts as a footnote to Alexander's greatness. This obscurity is unjust. Ariobarzanes achieved something remarkable. With limited forces and no support from the central Persian government, he created a defensive position that stopped the most successful conqueror in ancient history. His use of terrain, his fortification of the gates, his tactical deployment of forces showed military genius. The Battle of the Persian Gates demonstrated that Alexander was not invincible through supernatural advantage. He could be defeated. He could be forced to retreat. The myth of Macedonian invincibility was propaganda, not fact. Ariobarzanes proved this. He proved that intelligent use of terrain could neutralize Alexander's advantages in troop quality and tactical skill. He proved that defensive strategy could work against Macedonian offensive doctrine. He proved that courage and preparation could achieve victory against superior forces. His mistake was not tactical. His defense was nearly perfect. His mistake was strategic. He could not defend the gates indefinitely. Winter would eventually end. Alexander would eventually find the flanking route with or without local guides. The defensive position, no matter how strong, was temporary. Ariobarzanes should have used the gates to delay Alexander while evacuating Persepolis. He should have removed the treasury, burned the city, and retreated east to join forces still loyal to Darius. His defense bought time. He used that time to die gloriously rather than save what could be saved. But perhaps glory was the point. Perhaps Ariobarzanes understood the empire was doomed. Perhaps he chose to create one moment of Persian victory in a war of uninterrupted defeats. Perhaps dying in defense of the gates meant more than living to see Persepolis burn. The question of whether Ariobarzanes was hero or fool depends on what one values. If military effectiveness is the measure, he failed. His death accomplished nothing strategically. If courage and honor are the measure, he succeeded brilliantly. He fought when others fled. He died defending his homeland against impossible odds. Ancient sources do not tell us what happened to his family. Did he have sons who witnessed the defeat? Did he have a wife who mourned him? We do not know. History records the battles commanders fight, not the personal lives they leave behind. What we know is that Ariobarzanes, satrap of Persis, commander of the Persian Gates, chose death over surrender. He inflicted the only tactical defeat Alexander suffered in his conquest of Persia. And he died knowing that his courage at least was beyond question. The Macedonian troops who buried him understood this. Warriors recognize warriors across enemy lines. Ariobarzanes earned their respect through blood and determination. That respect, more than any monument, is his true memorial. The fall of the Persian Gates opened the road to Persepolis. No other significant defensive positions existed between the mountains and the ceremonial capital. Alexander's army, bloodied but victorious, resumed its march within 2 days of the battle. The Macedonian column moved through terrain that showed no signs of further resistance. Persian cavalry scouts observed from distant hills, but made no attempt to engage. Local villages emptied as news of the gates' fall spread. Inhabitants fled with whatever possessions they could carry, leaving behind ghost towns. Persepolis received news of Ariobarzanes' defeat with despair. The city that had stood as the symbolic heart of Persian power for 2 centuries now faced inevitable conquest. No army remained to defend it. No walls could withstand Macedonian siege techniques. No relief force existed to break a Macedonian blockade. City officials debated their options. Some argued for resistance. Burn the treasury rather than let Alexander claim it. Destroy the palaces rather than see them defiled. Die fighting rather than submit to foreign rule. Others advocated surrender, negotiate terms that would spare the population, offer the treasury in exchange for mercy, accept Macedonian rule, and hope for favorable treatment. The debate became irrelevant when Alexander's vanguard appeared on the hills overlooking the city. The Macedonian army had covered the remaining distance faster than expected. Persepolis had run out of time. Alexander sent envoys to the city gates. The message was simple: surrender immediately and the population would be spared. Resist, and every man, woman, and child would be sold into slavery after the city fell. Persian officials had no real choice. Without an army, resistance meant suicide. The gates opened. Macedonian troops entered Persepolis without fighting. The treasury exceeded even optimistic estimates. 120,000 talents of gold and silver filled the storerooms. Wealth accumulated over generations of Persian conquest and taxation. This treasure represented the economic foundation of the Achaemenid Empire. It had funded armies, built monuments, and maintained the vast administrative apparatus of imperial rule. Now it belonged to Alexander. The gold would finance his campaigns for years. The silver would pay his troops. The psychological impact of capturing the Persian treasury was as significant as the material wealth. The empire that had ruled the Near East for 2 centuries was bankrupt. Alexander occupied the royal palaces. He sat on the throne where Achaemenid kings had received tribute from subject nations. He wore Persian royal robes. He performed rituals that legitimized his claim as successor to Darius. But legitimacy was performance. Reality was conquest. The Macedonian army controlled Persepolis through military force, not Persian acceptance. The occupation was hostile despite the lack of active resistance. The casualty figures from the Persian Gates campaign revealed the true cost of victory. Macedonian losses in the initial assault and retreat numbered between 300 and 700 killed or seriously wounded. The night march over the mountain trail cost approximately 2,000 men, killed by falls, frozen to death, or lost in the darkness. The final assault added several hundred more casualties. The total Macedonian losses approached 3,000 men from an army of approximately 40,000. This represented nearly 8% casualties, a severe bloodying for any military force. More concerning than the numbers was the impact on troop morale. The Macedonian army had experienced its first tactical defeat. Soldiers who had marched with absolute confidence now understood they were mortal. The psychological invincibility that had carried them through previous battles had cracked. Officers noticed changes in troop behavior. Men questioned orders more frequently. Discipline required more enforcement. The casual arrogance that had characterized the army since crossing into Asia had been replaced by wariness. Alexander recognized the morale problem and addressed it directly. He visited wounded soldiers personally, praising their courage. He held ceremonies honoring the dead from the night march, presenting them as heroes who had achieved impossible feats. He distributed extra pay and bonuses to all troops who had participated in the campaign. The propaganda worked partially. Morale improved, but never fully recovered to pre-Gates levels. The army remained effective and professional, but the absolute certainty of victory had been lost. The campaign also revealed weaknesses in Macedonian intelligence gathering. The army had walked into the Persian trap with inadequate reconnaissance. Scouts had failed to identify the strength of Persian fortifications or the vertical nature of the defensive positions. This intelligence failure had cost hundreds of lives. Alexander implemented changes. Scout units were expanded and given clearer reconnaissance objectives. Local guides were recruited more systematically. Officers received training in terrain analysis and defensive position assessment. The night march, despite its casualties, became legendary. Stories of the impossible climb through winter darkness spread throughout the army and beyond. Later historians would cite it as an example of Alexander's tactical brilliance and his soldiers' extraordinary endurance. But the men who actually made that march remembered it differently. They remembered comrades falling into darkness. They remembered the cold that turned fingers black with frostbite. They remembered exhaustion so complete that death seemed preferable to another step. Victory at the Persian Gates was complete. The road to Persepolis stood open. The Persian treasury was captured. Ariobarzanes was dead. By any military measure, Alexander had succeeded. But the victory was not clean. It was not easy. It cost blood and revealed vulnerabilities. The invincible army had learned it could bleed. That knowledge would shape every subsequent battle of the campaign. The Battle of the Persian Gates stands as a masterclass in how terrain can neutralize technological and tactical superiority. Ariobarzanes understood that the Macedonian phalanx required space to deploy. The companion cavalry needed room to charge. Alexander's tactical genius depended on maneuver and flexibility. The narrow canyon eliminated all these advantages. The confined space turned the most advanced military force of the ancient world into a helpless column of targets. Vertical positioning made Persian defenders immune to counterattack, while Macedonian troops died without inflicting casualties. This defensive strategy was not original. Leonidas had used similar principles at Thermopylae 2 centuries earlier, but Ariobarzanes improved on the model. He added vertical dimension through cliff positions. He pre-positioned ammunition. He built multiple defensive walls, creating layered resistance. His execution was nearly flawless. Alexander's response demonstrated adaptability under pressure. Faced with an impregnable position, he refused conventional solutions. Siege would take too long. Alternate routes would allow Persian escape. Negotiation would show weakness. Instead, he chose the riskiest option available. The night march over the mountain trail was militarily insane by standard calculation. The casualty rate from environmental factors alone approached 20%. Arriving troops were exhausted and reduced in number. But the maneuver achieved complete surprise. Persian defenses faced the wrong direction. Ariobarzanes had prepared for frontal assault, not attack from the rear. The coordinated strike from 2 directions collapsed the defensive system instantly. The tactical lesson is clear. Defensive positions, no matter how strong, require security on all approaches. Ariobarzanes failed to guard the mountain trail because he considered it impassable to military forces. That assumption was nearly correct, but not absolute. Alexander proved that impossible terrain could be crossed if commanders were willing to accept severe casualties. The battle also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and local knowledge. The shepherd who guided the Macedonians was the decisive factor. Without local expertise, Alexander would never have found the flanking route in time. Military technology and training matter, But information superiority often determines outcomes. Ariobarzanes deserved fame comparable to Leonidas. Both commanders used narrow passes to hold off vastly superior forces. Both fought with extraordinary courage. Both died rather than surrender. Both achieved tactical victories against overwhelming odds. Yet Leonidas is remembered across millennia, while Ariobarzanes is forgotten. This disparity reflects how history is written by victors and their allies. Greek sources celebrated Leonidas because Greeks eventually defeated Persia. Persian sources that might have honored Ariobarzanes were destroyed when Alexander burned the library at Persepolis. The historical record we possess comes primarily from Greek and Roman historians, who viewed events through a Hellenistic lens. Alexander was their hero. His enemies existed only as obstacles to be overcome. Ariobarzanes appears in these accounts as a minor character in Alexander's story, not as a protagonist in his own right. This erasure from historical memory is unjust, but predictable. Defeated peoples rarely control their own narratives. The Persian perspective on Alexander's conquest was systematically suppressed. What survived emphasized Macedonian greatness and Persian decline. Modern historians have attempted to recover Persian voices from the fragmentary evidence. Archaeological work at Persepolis and other sites has revealed aspects of a Achaemenid culture that Greek sources ignored or misrepresented. But these efforts cannot fully restore what was lost. Ariobarzanes remains a shadowy figure. We know he fought. We know he died. We know he briefly stopped Alexander. Beyond these facts, almost nothing survives. His family, his background, his motivations exist only as speculation. The Persian Gates transformed Alexander's myth from invincibility to adaptability. He could be stopped. He could be forced to retreat. But he refused to accept defeat. That refusal, combined with willingness to take extraordinary risks, defined his greatness more than unbroken victory ever could. Ariobarzanes proved that courage and intelligence could challenge even the greatest conquerors. His defense was brilliant. His execution was nearly perfect. His failure came not from tactical mistakes, but from strategic impossibility. No single position could save a collapsing empire. The night march through winter darkness remains one of history's most dramatic military maneuvers. 2,000 men died to achieve surprise. The survivors arrived frozen and exhausted, but still capable of breaking the Persian defense. This feat speaks to both Macedonian discipline and the desperation that drives men to attempt the impossible. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. The conquest of Persia contains dozens of battles and sieges equally dramatic. Alexander's campaigns from Egypt to India created the ancient world as we know it. The stories of those who opposed him deserve to be told alongside his victories. Leave a comment with your perspective. Was Ariobarzanes a hero defending his homeland, or a fool dying for a lost cause? Would you have ordered the night march knowing 20% of your men would die before reaching the enemy? History provides facts. Interpretation remains open. The Persian Gates stood for 2 days against the invincible army. Then they fell. But those 2 days proved that courage and terrain can stop even Alexander the Great. That lesson echoes across the centuries to every defender facing impossible odds.